This is Mark Lieberman, the host of The World According to Mark. And today we're interviewing somebody who I've interviewed several times in the past, Julie Mayfield. Thank you, Julie, for agreeing to be on the show yet again. And Julie is a member of the North Carolina State Senate, representing District 49, which includes Asheville, North Carolina. And she assumed her office in January of 2021, and her current term goes through the end of 2024. And she had a very interesting career before becoming a member of the legislature. And specifically, she had a lot of particular interests and passions and responsibilities on issues that are still pretty fundamental and key in the legislature, including environmental and healthcare and so on. She has experience as having been the vice president and general counsel of the Georgia Conservancy, and she is now a senior policy advisor with a nonprofit called Mountain True, which advocates and does things to help the environment. And to stem the tide of global warming. And I think we're going to solve that problem with AI. But in any event, without further ado, I wanted to have Julie on the show today because there are a number of matters that have been pending, passed, discussed, debated in the North Carolina state legislature. There's been some interesting things that have happened, some of which are troubling to a lot of folk. For one thing, before I let Julie talk, is there had been a majority of Republicans in both houses, but one of the persons who had been elected as a Democrat, I believe in the House, decided to switch parties, very close to legislation that was ultimately passed that restricts the availability of abortion in North Carolina. And her vote was crucial to that decision, much to the concern and chagrin of the Democratic members, among others, and much to the delight, I suppose, with the Republicans who were sponsoring and pushing that legislation. But beyond that, North Carolina seems to be featured in the news a lot, not just in this region or statewide, but perhaps either as a follower or a bellwether of a lot of current trends that are sweeping across the country. And particularly in those states which, similar to North Carolina, either have a Democratic or Republican governor, but in many cases have a majority or a supermajority of Republicans. And that tends to allow one state to try its hand at passing some controversial legislation, which then is at least a model, potentially even a template for legislation in other states, including North Carolina. So with that long introduction, let me have Julie talk to us about what's been going on and what she sees down the road as far as North Carolina is concerned. And again, that may have an impact on other states, so of interest to other folks who are hearing this broadcast.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark. It's always good to be with you. I always enjoy our times together. So as you said, I think you're completely accurate in that North Carolina is, I would say we're more following rather than leading in some of these policy areas. But the fact that the Republicans have a supermajority in the legislature in both houses now, in both chambers, means that they can run all of the legislation that they tried to run the last 4 years that Governor Cooper vetoed. Over the last 4 years, the governor vetoed, I think, upwards of 50 bills, and a number of those are coming back through, and it's on everything from guns to abortion to LGBTQ rights, voting rights, all of the hot button issues, and we're seeing it all. And several of those controversial things have already become law over his veto, and the two most notable are the two that we've seen are the abortion bill that you mentioned, and a rollback in gun regulation, removing the state level background check that was required up until just a few weeks ago. So yeah, so this session has been a very different experience. In last session, my first session, a lot of these bills were passed, but of course we knew the governor would veto them, and we knew that we could sustain that veto. And now it's just very different to see these bills moving through, knowing that we can't stop them. All we can do is speak our piece and try to let people know, the people of North Carolina know what the Republican Party is doing, which in most of these cases is not actually what most people want.
And I guess this is my comment, and you can agree or disagree, is it seems as if a lot of the more hot button controversial issues are the ones where the votes are polarized, which is, I guess, maybe even not the correct word, that the votes that come in or you can predetermine them, but just based upon the particular party that the representative has, which is, again, to me, for a number of years, I felt that that's the most troubling. I mean, gerrymandering, which we might get around to talking about, and legislative minorities and majorities might not be so bad if the membership of the legislature didn't feel inclined to vote as sort of a straight party ticket on virtually everything that comes across.
So, and I agree. Let me just interrupt you for 1 second, though. Sure. So we do. So that is absolutely true when it comes to Republicans. I don't know that we've seen Republicans cross the aisle, so to speak, we have not on any of these issues, even though some of them are in incredibly close districts. Some of our senators who are in close districts and some of our Democratic representatives do in fact vote with the Republicans on some things, and that's fine. We understand that they're in very tight districts. They have, their districts are close to 50-50, and it's not some of these issues now, not any of these really hot button issues. But there are a lot of things we do that are, in fact, most of the things we do are not those hot button issues, but they're still really important, and they still make a big difference in the lives of people in North Carolina. And our Democrats have the freedom to vote the way that they need to vote to represent their constituents. The Republicans don't seem to have that freedom, or they don't exercise it if they have it.
Well, to your point, and I certainly understand what you're saying and agree, those Democrats that might not vote straight party, so to speak, on any particular legislation, as you've indicated, they're acting, I mean, they are representatives. They're supposed to vote in accordance with what they think the people in their district would want a lot of the time, although some of the time you would hope that they would expect, or that they would act like statespeople, state persons, statesmen, whatever the right word is, because they believe that it's the right thing, even if it might be controversial and go the other way. So as you said, to your point and also to my point, it still ends up at the end of the day that for most of the controversial issues, people are voting and thinking about the next election. And And that's what makes
Yeah.
it sometimes to come up with ultimately good policy, because policy is something that transcends hopefully politics, but these days that seems to be maybe something that happened historically, but not today. So
yeah,
let me
wishful thinking is the way I would describe that.
Right. So I'm going to pick up another point in a moment, but I just want to mention that you're on some pretty important and influential committees. Not that all committees don't have an important role to play in the process, but committees are where legislation originates, and where issues are ironed out, and then it goes or doesn't go to the floor with some input that's already been had at the committee level. So you're on, you mentioned before we went on air that you're the youngest member of the Rules Committee, which, if it's anything like, and I'm sure it is like, the Rules Committee and the US Congress, it's a very important committee. It sounds like it's ministerial and administrative, and to some extent it is, but it's fundamentally lays out what's going to be heard and when and so on and so forth. In addition, you're on the Healthcare Rules Committee, I believe.
The Healthcare Committee.
Healthcare,
so that's
I'm sorry. Yes, reading from my notes. Rules, redistricting, transportation, education, appropriations. So I want to just check on one thing. We had the abortion bill passed by a supermajority, and then they overrode the Governor Cooper's expected veto. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that one of the things that people were concerned about, other than the ultimate outcome, was it seemed to come about in somewhat of a clandestine manner, which is to say, there wasn't much notice that it was happening when it was happening. The persons who were primarily responsible for moving it from where it needed to be to the floor were pro-life, so to speak, and anti-abortion, which is another way of saying that. And there seemed, again, from the media reporting, little to no press coverage in advance, and not even participation by experts. And you and I talked again when we were trying to arrange for this interview, that there were a lot of experts around who were very vocal, including some OBGYNs and others from Duke, who had some very strong concerns and misgivings about this. And I thought to myself, well, where were they when this legislation was crafted? So let me stop and ask you to speak on that.
Yeah, so the normal process of any bill, of course, is that it's introduced. If the leadership decides that bill is going to move forward, it goes to a committee. There's a hearing in committee. There's a chance to ask questions, a chance to offer amendments. The public can speak. And then from there, it goes, as you mentioned, to the Rules Committee, and then from there to the floor for a vote. And all of that can take weeks and sometimes months as the bill gets refined and as people are working with the bill sponsors to craft amendments. And, there's a lot, frankly, most of the work that happens on any given bill happens behind the scenes. So and then of course the bill goes to the other chamber where it starts that process all over again. So there's always, for most bills, there's kind of 2 bites at the apple. And then sometimes there's even a 3rd bite at the apple if the House and Senate adopt different versions of the same bill. Then it goes to a conference committee where those differences get worked out. And that's your 3rd bite. This bill took a very different path. So what they did was they took a bill that had already passed the Senate and the House in different versions. So it was already in that conference committee, and they did a gut and replace. So they stripped all the language it's interesting. They actually kept the language of that original bill, but they added in all of the abortion stuff, as well as a handful of good things. But when a bill comes out of a conference committee, at that point, it's not a bill anymore. It's called a conference report. And that goes to each chamber for an up or down vote. There are no opportunities for amendments. Those don't even go through rules. There's no opportunity for public comment. They just go straight to the floor for an up or down vote. And that's what happened with this bill. So the timeline to remind folks or tell them if they don't know, the bill was announced, I believe, at 9 o'clock. It was about 7 o'clock on, I believe, a Tuesday night. We had a very unusual joint rules committee on Wednesday morning at 9. Oh, the bill did not actually get filed until about 11 o'clock Tuesday night. So it was announced, general outline, but nobody actually saw the text until 11 o'clock that night. 10 hours later, there was a rules committee that did go, and again, that was unusual on the Senate side, but the House does require conference reports to go through rules. So we had a joint committee. As a member of the Rules Committee, I got to ask questions. The chair did allow for public comment, which again is normal for Rules Committees, but so there was public comment. That committee meeting lasted, I guess, about 2 hours, maybe a little bit more than 2 hours. And then the bill was on the floor of the House. If I'm getting this right, maybe it was the next day, 48 hours later, and then it came to the Senate. No, it was on the floor of the House that afternoon, Wednesday afternoon, and then it came to the Senate Thursday afternoon. So it was just it was a very rapid and again no chance for amendments, none of that. So
let me just ask you, obviously the hackneyed phrase that looking at how legislation is passed is a little like watching sausage being made, but this is really very different. This is a slam dash approach. And it seems, I understand how they were able, and they is the proponents of the changes to the abortion law in North Carolina made by the dominant party, the party that has supermajority in the state legislature, notwithstanding the fact that, according to most polls, national, state, regional, whatever, most people don't really like additional restrictions being laid on reproductive health, abortion, notwithstanding the fact that the Supreme Court at the federal level basically said there's no constitutional right to abortion, which is what a lot of folks sometimes forget. They didn't say you can't have an abortion. They didn't say that the state can't have some rules, reasonable rules. They just said that don't look here, don't look to the Constitution, don't look to your US Supreme Court, because we're just simply saying the earlier decisions, Roe v. Wade in specific, don't apply. But what seems to be concerning is, first of all, as you indicated, there was a template, so to speak, or a conference report for bills that had been pending. Were those bills pending, if you know, prior to the Dobbs decision? Or
no.
Okay.
No. So the bill that all of this language got shoved into, so to speak, was a bill that was introduced in January, and that both, again, we and the House had passed. And that bill was fine. That bill passed, I think, virtually unanimously. It was about the safe surrender of infants when in the first few days after a child is born, the mother decides, I can't have this baby. I can't take care of this baby. So it was creating kind of a new safe surrender program. And again, that language is still in the bill, but
right. But again, and I'm sure you know this, so I'm not preaching anyhow, but I'm certainly not preaching to the choir. It just seems silly. Just be, you know, it was a maneuver. I won't even call it a loophole. It was, somebody said, here's an idea. Let's just take this bill that was pre-Dobbs. So these bills, or both bills in the conference report, and
well, they weren't pre-Dobbs.
Okay, they weren't pre-Dobbs.
No, they were just introduced. That bill was just introduced in January.
Okay, but I'm sorry.
Or February.
But they didn't have the types of highly restrictive things that are in the new law, but there was something there, and they said, well, let's just make some changes, but they weren't fundamental changes. They weren't proofing errors. They weren't tinkering around the edges. No. And that then allowed, because of, you know, again, some people would say procedural mumbo jumbo, allowed this legislation to just sail through. You mentioned that there was some public comment, but the quality of the public comment depends on a couple of things. How much notice the public had in order to mount a organized public comment, how much, you know, to what extent were a lot of the key players who would have had already prepared information to challenge some of the more restrictive measures. And if there was public comment, and again, you can't account for their absence, I suppose, but why weren't the experts from Duke or other medical schools, teaching hospitals, either in North Carolina or around the country, able to say, wait a second, you're not understanding about when problems might arise in the course of pregnancy, the issue of the ectopic pregnancy, and this and that, and so on and so forth, and the way in which, again, post-Dobbs, there already seems to be a fair amount of data about how women's health, not to mention the health of the fetus, are being jeopardized by these more restrictive bills. I mean, again, what's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, the drafters of the bill could have asked anyone for input. I have heard that they did consult with a couple of OBs, but those are interestingly OBs who are politically very conservative. And, you know, I don't even know how you could be an OB and not support a woman's right to an abortion. I just don't even know that, because it is fundamental health care for women. So, but certainly most of the OBs that I have spoken to and that have been at the legislature, and there have been dozens and dozens of them, are opposed to this bill because of the on-the-ground impact of it. And it's very clear that the people who drafted this bill don't actually understand, well, whether they understand or not, it doesn't matter. They are throwing hurdles in the path for political reasons. They are trying to reduce abortions in North Carolina. That is very clearly what they are trying to do. And one of my colleagues stood up on the Senate floor and said, we think this will save 3,000 babies a year in North Carolina at least. So their intent is clear. They want to reduce abortion access and actual abortions in North Carolina. And they don't really care how they do that. They don't really care the impact on women. If they, you know, in terms of how they do that, they have just, you know, and it's really, to some degree, the weeks, you know, you can have an abortion for any reason up to 12 weeks, and then for a couple of other exceptions up to 20 weeks, and then 24 weeks. That's those weeks are important. They're very important because functionally they have banned abortion for most people after 12 weeks, whereas currently it's 20, or previously it's 20 weeks. But they have put other hurdles in the path. So you now have to have 2 in-person visits for a surgical abortion, 3 in-person visits for a medical abortion. Any abortion after 12 weeks has to happen in a hospital. I think people don't even know what that looks like. How do you, do you just walk in to the emergency room and say, I want an abortion? I mean, how does this happen? Do the physicians that you go to at a Planned Parenthood clinic, for instance, have to have admitting privileges? Do you have, so, it makes it more complicated. It increases the cost, vastly increases the cost of having an abortion if you have to go to a hospital. And there are some inconsistencies in the bill that I and others have pointed out to the Republicans, and most importantly, on the issue of a medical abortion, which is when you take pills, the mifepristone that we've heard so much about recently. So the bill both says you can have a medical abortion up to 12 weeks, and then later in the bill, it seems to restrict that to 10 weeks. And as I have said to my Republican colleagues, every day matters now under this bill, and certainly 2 weeks matters a tremendous amount for women. And I want to say that, again, people shouldn't think, so it's true that most abortions happen before 12 weeks. That is a true statement. But functionally, this is an 8-week ban. And if the medical abortion is can actually only be done up to 10 weeks, for that, it's functionally a 6-week ban, because it takes about a month to get an appointment at an abortion clinic. So if you don't have that appointment, if you're 2 appointments for the first visit, the informational consent visit, and then the appointment for the actual abortion, by the time you're 8 weeks pregnant, you are SOL and you're having that baby. So it's not a 12-week ban. It's not that simple. It's not as simple. It's not as mainstream as they want you to think. It is functionally a much more limiting bill.
Let me ask you one question. I'm not sure I'm getting.
Oh, can I mention one other thing?
Sure.
About the mifepristone? So I think, again, we've heard a lot in the conversations about the federal litigation about mifepristone, challenging the FDA's approval of it, that mifepristone is not just used in abortions. It is used to help facilitate miscarriages later on, to induce miscarriages later on in pregnancy when there's something wrong with the child or with the pregnancy, or a threat to the mother. So this bill would seem to eliminate the ability of physicians to use that medication at that later stage of pregnancy, even when it is medically required or medically recommended. And that's, so again, if they had talked to physicians who actually serve women, a broad range of women at all stages of pregnancy, they would have realized that was a problem, and they would have made some provision for that. But they didn't do that. Instead, this bill is chock full of medically unnecessary and medically inconsistent provisions. And
medically dangerous provisions. And so, again, I don't know how things like this in terms of things like problems like this. In other words, if you're doing legislation that has an impact on people's lives and health, and there's medical data to be had and all kinds of things that need to be considered, which presumably weren't considered because they weren't necessary to the conference committee reports that were used as the foundation for these restrictive provisions, you would think that it would be against the law, so to speak, against any concept of good government, that those issues would not be vetted. But of course, that's not what that wasn't the rationale. The rationale is, here's an opportunity to glom onto something, get it pushed through. The devil in the details can be dealt with down the line, notwithstanding the fact that women's lives and the lives of the fetus are jeopardized by all this. I mean, it's just a horribly bad idea. So it's just like saying, we're going to pass some significant environmental legislation, but we're not going to talk to the people in the field that monitor this, the people that are responsible for dealing with pollution to begin with. We're just going to do that, or
that's right.
And we're going to we're going to build a controversial highway someplace, and it's going to have massive implications for traffic and so on and so forth. But we're not going to talk to anybody. We're just going to just do it ourselves because we're part-time, not to diminish your responsibility, part-time legislators, and sometimes full-time, other times painters and school teachers, and we know.
Well, and again, what they do is where they get their expertise is from the lobbyists who represent the interests. And I've been a lobbyist. We couldn't do our jobs without lobbyists. Okay. Right. I'm not one of these people who beats up on lobbyists, and I'm not one of these people who beats up on special interests. As an environmental advocate and as a previous environmental lobbyist, I have been one of those special interests. Every issue is its own special interest, and every issue has a set of lobbyists that come with it. So for people who like to criticize special interests, that is how our government runs. Right. We see hundreds and hundreds of bills, and there's no way we could possibly understand them all without the experts. The lobbyists and the clients that they represent are the experts that bring us the information we need. So, but what happens with this majority is that they just trust their experts, and they don't actually talk to the people very often, not always, but very often, to the people on the ground who will be most impacted and responsible for implementation of the bill. And the most recent example, which just got introduced a week ago, is the new, I'm just going to call it a voter suppression bill, because that's what it is. That clearly was drafted by lobbyists who are proffering the Trump theories of election integrity, that we need to do all of these things to protect the integrity of our elections, which of course are not actually, there's nothing wrong with our elections. But as I have started to talk to election officials who are looking at this bill and trying to figure out how on earth they're going to implement it, it's not implementable in the way that it's drafted in some cases. Or it is making it, which is the intention, of course, is to make voting incredibly more difficult, to create longer lines, to disincentivize people from voting, to make absentee voting much more difficult. Because, of course, that's what Democrats have started to use more rather than Republicans. They would never have done this if pre-COVID, it was Republicans who used absentee ballots much more. They would never have done any of this. But because Democrats started to use it more during COVID and post-COVID, there's now a problem with absentee ballots. So they're not interested in talking about the actual implementation. They are primarily interested in answering the calls of their base to do something about all of these issues, and they don't really care how it gets implemented on the ground.
Well, now that you've introduced the topic of voter suppression and bills or laws that might be passed in North Carolina, let's go into that a little bit more. What is out there right now? What has already passed? What may be passed? And
so we haven't passed anything yet this year. The Senate, I think, passed a bill with a handful of provisions. I don't think the House had passed anything, but this bill, it's a Senate bill that it's a big omnibus voting bill, and it covers a lot of territory, covers a lot of ground. But
typical, maybe I can help a little bit.
Yeah.
Get my question better. Typical, it seems to me, what I've heard in terms of legislation around the country is you do things like eliminate drop boxes or reduce them significantly, or you shorten the time period for which somebody can
early vote and things like that.
Or the Republicans, it would appear, seem to be on somewhat firmer ground when they talk about, well, voter ID. You need voter ID to cash a check. Why couldn't you have voter ID? But then the other question is, well, who isn't able to get it? What are the ramifications? So what flavors are we looking at here in North Carolina?
Yeah. So thanks to a North Carolina Supreme Court decision, voter ID is now the law in North Carolina. So everybody will need to show an ID at the next election, the next primary in the next election, and actually for even municipal elections this fall. And the law that the legislature passed several years ago details the kinds of ID that are valid for that. So voter ID is now kind of a done deal in North Carolina. What this bill does, so we don't have drop boxes, so that's not an issue. And this bill does not purport to shorten the number of days, the hours every day, no voting on Sundays. They have tried that before, and it all got shot down as being unconstitutional. So they didn't go there again. But they're taking aim at two things. Number one, absentee ballots, which, as I said before, are mostly used by Democrats now. So they're making that process more difficult. They're requiring more information on the outside of the envelope. And of course, every time you don't do something on the outside of the envelope, that gives the Board of Elections the ability to throw out your ballot. I think most boards of elections do try to cure those ballots. They'll reach back out to the voter, give you a chance to come in and cure your ballot and fix the problem. But again, there are now other increased requirements on election workers that's going to make that harder. They are requiring electronic signature verification for absentee ballots, which is a huge problem. It's all new software that every Board of Elections is going to have. And I don't know about you, but I have about 5 different signatures, depending on, how much time I have, depending on what the document is. Does it matter? And I have no idea which one of those I used when I registered to vote. I have no idea. So I don't know what the system is going to have in it for my signature. And if it doesn't match, they can throw it out. So that's a huge problem. We will also be the only state in the country that requires 2 witnesses on an absentee ballot and signature verification. So we are requiring the highest level of affirmation and confirmation of an absentee ballot of any state in the country. So that's one thing. And what I'm just telling people, and I'll tell your listeners, don't use an absentee ballot. If you can, just go to early voting. Just vote in person. That way you don't have to deal with any of this mess, and your ballot will be counted. They're just, and that's what they're trying to do, of course, which is ridiculous. The other thing that they're doing to try to make voting more difficult is they are making same day. So currently, during early voting, you can same day register and vote, and that vote counts. Now, the Board of Elections has a process to confirm that you are who you say you are and that you live where you say you live. But your vote, the default is your vote counts, and it only gets pulled if the Board of Elections cannot verify by mailing to you after you vote that you in fact live where you live. What this bill does is it changes your ballot to a provisional ballot. So it won't get counted until after the election, and it will only get counted if they think it matters. Let
me just stop because I'm making sure for clarity. We're talking about for any person who is not registered on the day that they intend to vote, either early voting or whatever. This process comes into play of
Correct.
Having to verify.
Correct. So if you've moved into a new precinct, you can go to early voting and change your registration right there. If you're new to town, you can vote and register to vote for the first time right there in early voting. You cannot do that on election day, but you can during early voting, and your vote will count. Your vote will count. Now, under this bill, if it becomes law, your vote would not count unless basically they need it to. So if the margin in any particular election is so close that the provisional ballots might make a difference, then they will open up those votes and count them. But if not, your vote won't count. And again, there's no, this is part of what feeds into the conspiracy, right? That people somehow register to vote during early voting and they register improperly or illegally, and they're not really supposed to vote. And, last election, my understanding is we had 110,000 people in North Carolina do same-day registration during early voting. That is a lot of people, and they want their votes to count. And again, the Board of Elections has a way, and they are required to verify your address by mailing a postcard to you after you vote. But this just flips it on its head and says your vote doesn't count, kind of unless we need it. It also does require the Board of Elections to do that same mailing process. Or you can physically go to the Board of Elections and show them the same ID that you showed when you registered to vote, and then your ballot will be fine. But that's requiring 2 trips of a voter rather than just one. So again, they're just trying to make it more difficult. And you know who does same-day registration during early voting? Young people and a lot of people of color.
So not only does that process sound ridiculously complicated and, as you say, intended to restrict voting, I would assume that it's also requires more administrative time, effort, manpower to implement it. And how would you know, for example, what would be your course of action if they didn't send out that postcard after the election? They just didn't get around to it, or it got shoved away someplace that wasn't important. I mean, it all assumes that the process works like clockwork, but if there's one process that tends not to work like clockwork, it's voting and processing votes.
Well, I would disagree with you there. I think we have a very solid process for voting, for processing ballots, for processing absentee ballots, for curing absentee ballots. But they are just putting additional hurdles in the way.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, because you didn't mention it yet, and maybe you're going to, or do we have one of those really bad voting changes that allow, regardless of the vote, for somebody, Secretary of State or some other person, to say, I disagree. I think even though it looks like so-and-so won, this vote doesn't count. We can throw this out.
No, this bill does not do any of that. It does not, for instance, pitch the determination of the validity of an election to the legislature, which we've seen in some states, maybe Arizona, I can't remember. So it does not change that. It leaves the I can't remember what the final sort of determination of the election, the certification. Thank you, to the Board of Elections. It does not change that process.
And while since I mentioned that, what is the composition of the Board of Elections?
So the board, So the board of Elections has 5 members. The majority of those members, so 3 of those members, are always the party of the governor. So and this is true in I believe in every county. The Board of Elections will be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans.
Okay.
But there is a nonpartisan, theoretically nonpartisan elections administrator. And I think again, all of these things are solving problems that don't exist, that we have not seen in North Carolina, that are not problems in North Carolina. This bill completely plays to the theories and conspiracies around elections.
And it plays to that, but the intention is, by restricting voting, some people who are have more time and more sophistication and a network can work around these provisions, while people who just getting them out to vote, like a student, a person in a rural area, a person of color, whatever, the concept, which presumably was motivating this, was to restrict the voting amongst those folks who are more likely to vote Democrat.
Absolutely.
Okay.
That is absolutely the case.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So why don't we talk a bit about a concern that some people have had about the restrictions on the power of the governor and the erosion, so to speak, of the concept of separation of powers. When we talked, you had, before the broadcast, you had reminded me that some of these issues concerning the limitation of governor's rights, not giving the governor too much power, occurred before the current Democratic governor in the preceding governorship of Governor McCrory, who was a Republican. But you also indicated that we should talk on the show about how that has only accelerated, and a number of other things which people might not, by their reading, construe as diminishing the power of the governor, has done that. So can you talk about some of those things?
Yeah, so just to remind, little Civics 101, remind your listeners, we have 3 branches of government: judicial, executive, and legislative. And one of the themes of this legislative session is that this legislature, with its supermajorities, are consolidating power within it and blurring the lines and weakening the checks and balances that exist between the other 2 branches. So I'll start first, since you mentioned it, with the executive branch. We just passed a bill, and I feel sure the governor will veto it, a bill that removes a lot of the appointment powers that the governor has to state boards. These are boards that pass rules. These are boards of agencies that pass rules that ultimately are responsible for implementing the laws that the legislature passed. So in our Constitution, the governor is the one tasked with faithfully executing the laws that are passed by the General Assembly. By eroding and removing the appointment power of the governor in many cases, and replacing it with legislative appointments, it puts the legislature in the role of appointing either, in many cases, an equal number or sometimes even more people to these boards than the governor. And you can't do that, because that then functionally puts the legislature in charge of implementing the law instead of the governor. And this theory was tested, as you mentioned, several years ago when Governor McCrory was in office. The legislature did this with a number of boards and took away governor appointments and put themselves in that position to appoint those people. Governor McCrory sued and won at the North Carolina Supreme Court. It was a 6-1 decision that doing that is clearly unconstitutional. The governor must have a majority of the appointments on these boards. Well, the one person who dissented in that opinion is still on the court, and he is now the Chief Justice. And the court, of course, is now a majority Republican court. And the legislators who have pushed this bill have been completely transparent about the fact that they think they will get a different decision from this court, that the Chief Justice will be able to influence his colleagues, and they will get a decision that says this is not a problem, and the legislature can have all of these appointments. So that is, again, blurring the line between the legislature and the executive, and putting the legislature in charge of much more than anyone ever envisioned they would be. On the judicial side, that line is blurring as well, because the budget, the Senate's budget anyway, allows for the legislature to appoint a number of new special judges that can then be appointed to hear special cases, and including cases that come directly out of the legislature. So if someone challenges a law that the legislature passes or makes a constitutional challenge against any law, it goes to a special 3-judge panel. That panel used to be appointed by I believe a Superior Court judge, I think in Wake County. The new proposed provisions would make it so that the Chief Judge of the North Carolina Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, appoints those 3-judge panels, and they can draw from these 10 judges that the legislature has the power to appoint. So they are packing the court literally packing the court in a way that will benefit them. And it is, as an attorney, I mean, it is, I find it embarrassing. I find it shameful. And there's just, again, there's not really a way to challenge it.
There's no remedy. What you're saying, and it's astonishing for me as an attorney or former attorney, hearing you say there's no remedy, because I would have thought somewhere in the North Carolina Constitution, or perhaps if the Supreme is for the U.S. Constitution, spoke to the issue, or some law that would not likely be challenged, it would deal with the issue of who has the power to create these so-called ad hoc, I'm calling them ad hoc,
special judges.
Judges.
Yeah.
And remove that authority from the state Supreme Court and the lower courts.
Yeah.
And it's, as you say, it's obvious if one person who can be partisan has the power to delegate the authority to, well, let me ask you this question. Those judges that would serve in these special courts, just to be confirmed, they're not elected. They're not elected. Merely appointed.
Yes.
Whereas Supreme Court justices in the state of North Carolina are elected, correct?
Every other judge in North Carolina is elected.
So this would be a special monolithic dedication of authority to the Chief Justice, who, while he is elected, is also partisan.
Yes,
or at least a member.
Because the legislature made judicial elections partisan several years ago.
And they did that by
passing a law that says every judge will have an R or a D next to their, and I believe, I heard this, I have not confirmed this, but I just heard this past week, that we are the only state in the country that has partisan judicial elections. That seems strange to me, because this is a sort of a tried and true strategy to get more Republican judges elected in Republican leaning states. So I don't know that that's true, but I did hear that.
Okay, well, that's
it's not the norm. We'll just say it that way.
Let me hit one other subtopic under this that we talked about earlier before we went on air. There's a law that gives Republicans and Democrats equal control in the legislature over the state and county elections, changing what was the province of the governor to pick a majority of the election board. Do I have that correct?
Oh, I don't think of the election board. I don't think anything changes there. That actually might be constitutional. What I did mention is, and this is one of the other insidious things, in terms of expanding, or I guess consolidating power, is there is legislation that would allow the legislature to appoint members of community college boards. Is that maybe what we were talking about?
Could have been, but still go ahead on that one.
Yeah, so currently community college boards are appointed by the governor, the county commission, and the local school board, those three. And what this bill does would remove the ability of the governor to make those appointments or the local school board to make those appointments. Give those to the legislature. So now the legislature is appointing 8 people and the county commission is appointing only 4, and the governor has none and the local school board has none. So again, solidly, squarely putting the legislature in control of every community college in the entire state. And, and it's, again, we've seen this in other states. Education is the new front for the Republican Party in terms of gaining power. They're gaining power at Board of Elections. One of the other themes we've seen this session is legislators are making boards of education partisan all across the state. Again, assuming that if you now in most counties that's going to be true, right? If you put the R next to the name, that's how people. It's not true here in Buncombe County, of course, and in a few other counties that wouldn't be true. But they are making education a partisan issue, and they're doing it all the way up, not just school boards in counties, but all the way up to the community college system. And of course, they made the board of governors for the UNC system partisan years ago. They control all of those appointments.
So we just have a few minutes left with my conversation with Julie Mayfield, a member of the legislature in North Carolina representing District 49. I guess one thing, just to close out what you just said about the ability of the power of the legislature over community colleges, and they're involved in all other aspects of education, that then translates into, from policies that we're hearing about across the country and at the national level, what kind of curriculum can be taught, to what extent can you talk about what's referred to colloquially or incorrectly as CRT, what can you talk about with respect to transgender and LGBTQ.
That's right.
And that's how that comes into play. And so if you can just in a couple of minutes, hit the LGBTQ and transgender issues that are most concerning to you.
Sure. So like states all across the country, we've seen a whole set of bills around this that target the LGBT community and particularly the trans community. There are 3 bills that have passed at least one chamber this year. The first one of those is our version of the Don't Say Gay bill that prohibits curriculum around gender or gender identity in K through 4th grade, and then has required disclosure requirements if a student comes to a teacher and says, I think I might be gay, or I'm struggling with mental health issues, a whole host of things. So that's problematic. We have also banned the Senate has passed a bill that would ban transgender girls from participating in girls' sports. So these are boys who are transitioning to girls, and the bill would not allow them to participate in girls' sports. And then the third is a bill banning gender-affirming care for people under 18. That's passed the House. So none of those have been passed by both chambers. None of those are law yet. None of those have gone to the governor, but I would anticipate that all of those will move before the end of session.
All right. Well, that's very concerning, and that's an example of what you said earlier. North Carolina may not be the leader, but it's certainly the follower of a lot of other states which have waded into these waters. And it's concerning. It's not a lot of people that are affected, but the implications of it are vast.
That's right.
So I want to thank my guest again, Julie, for being on the show. Very informative. A lot that we tried to cover and didn't, but a lot that you said that I think is really important for folks to know about. So thank you again for being on the show.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Mark. Anytime.
Okay, see you next time. Take care.
Take care.